A new gang of drug criminals for a new and spreading traffic in heroin addiction and death. Richard Schlesinger reports.
It is considered one of the hot commodities in the drug business. Heroin use, after years of decline, is on the rise again.
Professionals in the field of 30 years have never, ever seen that much heroin available on the streets of this country.
With the new expanding market, there is a lot of money to be made and new criminal gangs anxious to make it. One group has ridden the crest of the heroin wave to the top in New York, the biggest heroin market in the country. They are members of Chinese gangs, loosely organized, efficient businessmen who have moved in and taken over from the more traditional criminal organizations.
They've totally replaced, in all practical terms, replaced the old Sicilian, Mafia, Corsican, French connection cases. They've swamped them. They've put them out of business, really.
In the mid-'80s, high-profile federal prosecutions of the Mafia unintentionally helped the Chinese gangs. Cases dubbed the Pizza Connection and the Commission broke the old mob monopoly on heroin. One set of mobsters went to jail and another took over.
In 1983, only 4% of that heroin was controlled by Chinese trafficking organizations. Today, it is probably somewhere between 65 and 80%.
Federal agents have a tough time cracking the new Chinese gangs. Here in New York's Chinatown, the new kings of heroin can blend in and hide out. They distrust non-Asians and operate according to traditions that Westerners find hard to understand.
You know that, right? They like close-up. You know that, right?
There have been some successes. Federal agents raided several Chinatown jewelry stores and restaurants that they say were laundering heroin profits for the Asian gangs. And there are huge profits to launder. Heroin is now selling for 10 times the amount of cocaine. And the heroin dealers are about to introduce a new product, smokable heroin, which the DEA says will become yet another drug problem for the 90s. Richard Schlesinger, CBS News, New York.
Federal agents who trailed an Asian drugs and guns connection all the way to Hong Kong today were hauling in key suspects in New York and Washington. In all, the undercover investigation, which ran for more than a year, brought 24 arrests. More are expected. 11 men are being held in Hong Kong, where the drug ring is based. The Hong Kong drug lords, out to build a heroin smuggling network to Washington and New York, were duped into forming a partnership with a Chinese-speaking FBI agent posing as a U.S. drug kingpin. Authorities estimated that nearly $140 million worth of heroin, referred to as seafood in coded phone calls to Hong Kong, was seized.
The amount of heroin purchased, the 24.7 pounds, is enough to overdose every man, woman, and child in the District of Columbia.
The investigation, dubbed Operation Bamboo Dragon, was aimed at sending a message to Asian gangs who have been spreading their tentacles into the U.S. drug trade.
We believe that the Chinese organizations are responsible for almost 70% of the heroin coming into the New York area. They've replaced the traditional Italian organized crime gangs.
Today's preemptive action stunts the emergence of an Asian organized crime group which sought to peddle its deadly product on our streets.
In addition to drugs, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and customs agents seized dozens of guns, including automatic weapons, the Asian gang was selling. Undercover agents had pretended to be buying the M16 rifles for Libya. Authorities say the Hong Kong residents now in custody will be extradited to the United States to stand trial. Eric Engberg, CBS News, Washington.
Next tonight, we turn to an issue that won't go away: drugs. Yesterday, New York City police and the FBI concluded what they called the biggest U.S. drug raid ever. 100 FBI agents and policemen raided 3 New York locations and arrested 19 suspects linked to a major Southeast Asian drug ring. They also seized more than 800 pounds of heroin, most of it packaged in these tires, and confiscated $3 million in cash. The drugs were shipped from the infamous Golden Triangle, an area that includes Thailand, Burma, and Laos. The raids followed an 18-month international investigation involving police departments from Hong Kong to New York. Worldwide, 45 members of the Southeast Asian drug ring have been arrested. Officials say the raids confirm that the Chinese have now replaced traditional organized crime groups as major suppliers of heroin to the U.S.
Over the last few years, the Chinese have greatly increased their activity in the illegal heroin distribution. We estimate that today they control 70 to 80% of the heroin operation here in New York City.
Officials say the amount of heroin seized would supply about half of New York's addict population for a year. Joining us now for a Newsmaker interview is the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District here in New York, Andrew Maloney, the principal prosecutor in charge of the investigation. Mr. Maloney, James Fox, the FBI, just gave the facts about the Chinese now controlling, as he said, 80%. When you say Chinese, which Chinese do you mean?
Well, I mean, people who are Chinese by birth, many of them, of course, living in Hong Kong and Singapore and in this country as well.
These are not mainland Chinese, the People's Republic Chinese.
They originally, some of them were original mainland Chinese, but whatever reason, they're Chinese extraction, of course.
Does this implicate the government of mainland China?
No, it does not. No doubt.
It does not. What problems does it pose for the FBI and, in this case, the New York City Police to be dealing with a ring or an alleged ring that is largely Chinese in terms of the appropriate number of agents, languages, all that kind of thing?
Well, there are problems that are being addressed, but they are still being addressed, and that's the problem, number one, of language. One of the problems we have with the wiretaps in this case, and there were numerous wiretaps that went on for some 18 months, was the recruiting Asian Americans, both FBI and New York police, who could monitor these recordings and understand them, as well as the normal surveillance you want to do and undercover work you want to do with these Asian groups. It is a problem, and it's being addressed by the FBI. I understand from Mr. Fox that right now the FBI have aboard 100 Asian American agents for this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Does the pattern of Chinese control of the trade apply only to heroin?
Well, it's principally heroin, but in this particular case, we didn't even make a point of it when we announced the arrest here, but we had seized at least 25 kilograms of cocaine from the same organization. They were trading heroin for cocaine for their own uses, but they're principally heroin.
Mm-hmm. What effect does the seizure have on the drug scene here in the New York area, do you think?
Well, based on my experience of some years ago, having worked some of the old French Connection cases, a seizure of this size should have an effect short-term, and it should show up in about 6 months. There's enough heroin in the pipeline not to be felt for about 6 months. But in about 6 months or so, we should see signs of the price of a street bag of heroin going up and the quality going down. But that won't continue.
And that would last for?
A period of time, but until other networks take over, like this particular one.
Yeah. You mentioned the French Connection, which had a very big publicity a few years ago. How does this compare in size to the French Connection?
Oh, it's much, much bigger. The original French Connection case, which was in the mid-'60s, the movie version, was about 72 pounds of heroin. There were other French Connection cases, which I myself prosecuted in the early 70s in Manhattan, and the largest individual seizures were about 210, 220 pounds. So this is humongous compared to those particular seizures.
What does heroin represent? What part of the drug traffic and consumption in the New York area does heroin represent nowadays?
Well, unfortunately, New York City is still the heroin capital of the world. We have half the addicts of this country are in New York City, and they estimate anywhere from 200 to 250,000 heroin addicts in New York City. Largely,
is that a growing population of addicts, or stable, or dwindling? Or?
Well, up until some recent reports, we believed it was rather stable, and it was getting older. There are some indications that it may be expanding again, but in recent years, it's been an older population, and the drug of choice, of course, right now is crack.
Mm-hmm. And can you say if there are 250,000 heroin addicts, how many cocaine and crack addicts there are in comparison with that?
There's many more cocaine addicts. I don't have a number off the top of my head. I think that one of the numbers you see is there's some 6 million cocaine users in the country. How many of them are firmly addicted is anybody's guess.
Mm-hmm. When the authorities pull off a coup like this, you are justifiably proud, because it's an amazing piece of first undercover work and follow-up and everything else. But you all continue to say you get only a fraction of the drugs that are in the trade. Is that still true?
Oh, I think it is. Last year, unheard of numbers of pounds of cocaine, for instance, were seized in my district alone. There was some 15,000 pounds of cocaine seized in Long Island, Queens, and Brooklyn. That was unheard of years ago. Yet we estimate that's only maybe 20% what's coming into the country.
If there is one Asian ring operating, which you now, if your allegations turn out to be true, have stopped, how many others are there likely to be on the same kind of trade route, would you say?
I couldn't guess at that, but we think that, particularly in Hong Kong, that the criminal elements in Hong Kong are doing all they can to get all the money they can before 1997, because come 1997, the People's Republic will take over and they'll hang them. So they're trying to move all their money and all their goods as fast as they can over the next decade. But the main source, the principal source, of course, of all this heroin is Thailand, back in the jungles and the hills, mostly from what is called the Shan United Army, which is an old contingent of the old National Chinese Army. It's run by a fellow named Kan Sa, and he accounts for about 50% of the heroin sold or produced in the entire world. But he's insulated up in the jungles and mountains of Thailand.
Does finding out one pattern help you to predict other ones? Does this give you insight into other possible rings, or is it all purely accidental? Are they so ingenious that that finding one doesn't give you real clues?
No, not the methodology changes from day to day. They will smuggle heroin in any number of places, from cans of molasses to ski poles to fish. The mind of man is it's just infinite, the number of methods they would use to smuggle heroin. Mm-hmm. That really doesn't help us.
Do you really depend on tip-offs, blind tip-offs, for a big coup like this? Was that what originally started the...
No, what originally started this was some confidential information about Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu was a well-known businessman in Chinatown. He was at one time chairman of the Democratic Club in Chinatown, a very well-known figure. And in October of '87, we were told by some confidential informants that he was doing more than just that he was brokering heroin. And that's what we discovered during the course of these 18 months of investigation, mostly through wiretaps and surveillances. In addition to the 820 pounds that was seized on Monday night, during the course of the investigation, there was another 150 pounds seized, rather skillfully by the FBI and Canadian police, so as not to tip off this network that we were onto them, and an additional $2 million. So we're talking about $5 million in cash that have been seized. That is one case, along with over 950 pounds of heroin total.
The debate going on in this country right now, briefly, about where the emphasis should be when funds are scarce and everything, interdiction of the trade, just as you've just successfully done in one part, or education of users, potential users, and all that. You've been at this for a long time. What's your own personal feeling about that?
I think everybody in law enforcement preaches the same gospel, namely that all we can do is contain it, reduce it, and in the long run, it's going to be education, it's going to be rehabilitation, the demand side. And that may take a generation or more to turn that attitude around.
Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Hey, buddy. Yo, what do you got there? Yeah, you can do that. Okay, you guys ready? No. You're ready.
Let me introduce.
Where's this guy drinking, man?
Wouldn't you like to know? You just mind your business. Don't ask too many questions. We're with you in 1 second.
It's Pat Hines, an agent, special agent with the ATF. And my left is Agent Gary Hilberg with Customs, and we happen to have a visiting fireman here on our left, the Commissioner of Customs for Hong Kong, Patrick Williamson, who his agency had some part of this case in Hong Kong. Actually, the biggest part of it was by the Royal Hong Kong Police, I suppose. But if you might generally want to ask him some questions, perhaps about conditions in Hong Kong, if you like, after we finish our formal remarks. We're here this afternoon to announce the culmination of an almost 2-year undercover operation here in New York by agents of the ATF and U.S. Customs, resulting in today's arrest. It's related to a larger conspiracy case which has been announced today by Judge Sessions, the director of the FBI in Washington, D.C. That case is basically a heroin smuggling case involving a number of Chinese operating out of Hong Kong and across the United States. 3 of the defendants arrested here in New York today are part of that drug conspiracy. Those subjects were not only part of a heroin smuggling conspiracy, they were also dealing in machine guns, which they were arrested for today in Flushing, Queens. Today's arrest occurred at Francis Lewis Boulevard and Northern Boulevard when a delivery of 50 machine guns were made in an undercover operation, which was the first part of 1,000 machine guns this organization was prepared to deliver had the conspiracy continued. Arrests have been made here in New York. There are a total of 6 under custody, and there are warrants out for 2 more, all of whom are Chinese, except for 1 American. The drug case, which is announced in Washington, has arrests in New Jersey, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Texas, and of course at least 11 defendants have been arrested last night in Hong Kong. I'll open it up for questions.
Where were the guns going?
Well, according to the complaint, these guns in an undercover capacity were destined for Libya, but that was part of the undercover scam. We were, of course, never going to permit them to go to Libya.
Where did they come from?
I'd let Pat Hines of the ATF perhaps answer that question.
The majority of the handguns and machine guns came from out of state, from Texas, from Georgia, from Virginia. Out of the last 50 machine guns that were just seized by ATF and U.S. Customs, we knew beforehand that 19 of those were coming from Nassau and Suffolk County on Long Island. The other ones will be determined after we can make a laboratory analysis, since some of the, all the serial numbers have been raised or obliterated. It'll take a laboratory firearms technology expert to bring them up. But we have identified 19 is from Long Island.
Did any of the guns make it
The AR-15s, which are manufactured to be semi-automatic, have been altered to fire fully automatic. It's a manipulation of the trigger assembly which enables them to fire more than 1 bullet with 1 pull of the trigger.
How does it come that a wealthy nation like Libya buys a lot of guns, winds up buying machine guns from somebody in Elmhurst, Queens?
No, I think you misunderstood.
Was going to buy, okay.
Well, our undercover scam was going to buy him.
That was the scam.
That was the scam.
You created
What we have basically here is a Chinese drug ring, which is also dealing in guns in the New York area.
Did this ring sell any guns overseas prior to this sting operation?
Want to answer that, sir?
To our knowledge, they never sold any guns overseas. Again, as the United States Attorney indicated, this was part of the Customs and ATF scam to get them to sell the guns to us, with the understanding that we were going to be delivering to Libya. And that was the intent.
Are you able to determine that this is part then of a flourishing business, the selling of guns? I mean, is it common for them to sell to foreign governments such as Libya? Some of them sold to drug dealers. This kind of thing. Where's the market for this kind of weapon?
Want to answer that?
Yeah. The market for the handguns in the New York City area is quite open. The firearms that were purchased out of state were purchased at a much lesser rate than were sold for in New York City. Our people that are on the street tell us that, especially in the Chinatown or Chinese community, the people have a difficulty in the language, and these firearms were coming into Chinatown, and they were selling these firearms also to people indigenous to Chinatown and to Chinese organized crime, the Flying Dragons, the Fukinese, and the Tungyang.
You say the rest of the people today are breaking up of an Oriental gang?
That's correct. The Judge Sessions in Washington today announced the arrest of several dozen defendants who were part of a Chinese heroin smuggling ring, some of whom were also arrested in New York on these gun charges.
Mr. Hilbert, are you targeting the Oriental gangs now? In the past, Judge Webster had talked about the new emerging groups. Are the Chinese one of them, and how significant are they?
To answer your question, yes. The federal agencies in New York, the OCDETF Organized Crime Task Force, and in particular U.S. Customs, we've organized some teams, special units, to start targeting some of these Southeast Asian ethnic groups.
What are they getting involved in?
Well, right now, if I can interrupt, right now we believe that Chinese organizations are responsible for almost or 70% of the heroin coming into the New York area. They've replaced the traditional Italian organized crime gangs in the supply of heroin in this city, we believe.
What about their emergence in gun trade?
Yes, the emergence in gun trade is not only peculiar to the Chinese, but all organizations now dealing in narcotics. We find U.S. Customs, ATF, all the federal law enforcement agencies, state and local, find that these crack dealers, heroin dealers, anything to do with narcotics, they're stockpiling firearms and selling them to protect the narcotics trade.
Can you describe in your own words the scope of this arrest and how big is it in your estimation?
Well, it's the drug part of the case is the larger part of the case, and that's extremely significant from an international smuggling matter. Insofar as right here in New York is concerned, the gun part is very important because that's what affects the wars that go on between various crime groups here in the New York area. So how do you measure the significance that I couldn't put words into it? I'm sorry.
Let me ask this, though. These weapons, modified as they are capable of firing 30 rounds a second. I mean, do the people in the drug business or whatever crime business they're in the city of New York really think there's a use for this vicious a weapon to protect themselves or to attack others? I mean, is that going on or about to go on in this city?
Well, I think it's better for an enforcement person to speak on this subject, but if you notice, there was an announcement the other day that a proposal that all drug enforcement agents be armed with semi-automatic weapons and machine guns in the future because they feel the firepower has been shifted to some of these, particularly in the crack area, these posses and other drug operations in various parts of the city that we're seeing with a lot of violence.
Was there any heroin seized in Hong Kong, and where was it going?
Yes, there was, an answer to your question. I haven't got those numbers. I can give them to you in a few minutes, though.
Mr. Williamson, from your perspective in Hong Kong, what do you see here today as a result of this case impacting or affecting the trade between the two locations?
Well, I'm concerned with the drug side and delighted that yet another group have been hammered hard and we've got a big seizure.
Now, have you seen this before? Is this significant in terms of putting a crack into this trade between Hong Kong and the United States?
Yes, there have been three big arrests in the last 3 months, which we've been involved in some of them, in the Hong Kong Police and the Independent Commission Against Corruption, in cooperation with the New York Drug Enforcement Administration.
From your perspective, could you describe what the network is like between Hong Kong and the United States in dealing in heroin and guns?
I don't think there's any dealing in guns between Hong Kong and the United States. Let's get that quite clear. We have very few illegal arms in Hong Kong, and there's never traditionally been a problem there.
As far as the heroin?
As far as the heroin is concerned, there is no doubt, I'm afraid, that a lot of the organization is being done by Hong Kong people. I don't think much of the drugs are actually going through Hong Kong, though. I think they're going other ways.
What specific problems do the Oriental gangs, the Chinese gangs, pose for U.S. law enforcement?
Well, again, I probably better answered by an enforcement person, but obviously Chinese dialects, getting undercover operatives who can deal with the Chinese, simple matter like wiretaps with the dialects that are involved, create a lot of managerial problems to infiltrate those kind of organizations.
Do you see the Chinese as the emerging group taking over the heroin trade from the Italians?
Well, to repeat myself, they already have. It's not merging, it's there. And we believe that they account for about 70% of the heroin coming into the New York area today.
Could anybody give a little flavor for the scenario of these undercover meetings as to were any of your agents portraying Libyan agents, if you will, in dealing with these people? Could you give a flair for that?
Yes, during the negotiations for the machine guns, we represented ourselves as procurement people for the Libyan government.
Spies?
They may consider that, yes.
Did you use people of Arab extraction for that?
Not in this particular scenario, no.
So, could you give us a flavor for what the people said, how they felt about dealing with the Libyans?
We're really limited to what's charged in the complaint. We can't go into any real details of evidence in the case other than what's confined to the complaint. Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tony, if yourself or any of the agents could just give us a quick description of the AR-15, how it's been altered or anything like that.
We're out of here, boss.
These two gentlemen here on stage.
Pretty help today.
You see the whole strip?
Thank you.